All right. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations here with the Men and Masculine Folks Network. We are a program of men as peacemakers, and together our goal is to shape new meanings of masculinity that are authentic, caring, and thoughtful. So these conversations are a way for us to start seeing more of the people around us, practicing that collective care, and being responsible and accountable to one another as we live our lives, and just acknowledging that every single one of us is whole, and all of our experiences and beliefs and all of these things that make us who we are, we see them all as valid and beautiful. So thank you so much if you are here joining us live, or if you're listening after the fact. We love that. We love to connect with all of you. And so for those who don't know, maybe this is your first time hearing us or seeing us pop up on your Facebook Live or YouTube. So every month, we basically choose a topic that can help us as men and masculine people identify what our role might be in creating safe, thriving communities, men and masculine folks, and all gender identities as well. And so we host 2 discussions every month, typically. And the first conversation of the month, which is today's convo, focuses on developing a deeper understanding of the topic that we're addressing. And then the second time we meet up during the month, we talked about the practical, how do we actually do this now in our everyday lives? What does it look like to be practicing these values or these ways of being in community? And so, again, just a reminder, all of these conversations are just a way for us to come together and learn some new things together, hear from different perspectives, and just grow together in this journey we call life in community. And so today, and for the month of July, we are going to be talking about something called potholes. And what do we mean by that? We'll get into it here in a minute, but I want to give my friend here, Hunter, a minute to introduce himself, and I'll do that as well. So my name is Sean Hayes. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am here in Duluth at Men as Peacemakers, and just excited to see where today's conversation goes. And I'll pass it over to you, sir.
Thanks so much, Sean. So, hey everyone, my name is Hunter Beckstrom, use he, him, and his pronouns, and I work at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MNCASA, and I'm a prevention program coordinator. So, obviously, right up in today's alley for the theme that we're going to be digging into today. And I always love spending some time with Sean and digging into these really important conversations.
Love that. And I know some of you may recognize Hunter. It's been a little bit since you've been able to join us. So, yeah, just feeling extra grateful that you're able to be here today. And so some of our other friends are off doing other things. So, of course, Felix and Nick and Sean, we're sending y'all love, and we'll see you next time when you join us. But yeah, so for today's purposes, potholes in prevention work. What the heck does that mean? What are potholes? And this concept is something that we pull directly from one of our curriculums that we created for our Don't Buy It project here at Men as Peacemakers. And so how we define this concept is that potholes are ideas, opinions, and arguments that basically end up distracting us from whatever our ultimate goal is when it comes to prevention of violence. So whether we're talking about sex trafficking prevention or exploitation, whether we're talking about bullying that's happening in schools, or domestic violence or intimate partner violence, it's really important, we've found, to try to look at and figure out where these potholes show up in our conversations, whether it's work conversations for those of us who do this work on the regular, or whether it's in everyday conversations where we just kind of end up getting stuck in these like kind of revolving door conversations, and then nothing really seems to be settled, or things aren't actually then happening to like create the change we want to see in our communities. And so when we talk about potholes, it's helpful, I've found, because then we can redirect those conversations back to like the more generative, productive kinds of conversations or dialogues about like, how do we actually leverage our gifts and our skills within community to like be a part of preventing violence and creating ways for folks who experience that violence to exit and find safety and healing afterwards as well. And so basically the main thing is to remember is that our goal is not necessarily to like win an argument or to even really change someone's mind, especially when we all have very different lived experiences, and so that shapes our perspectives, right? It shapes how we show up in the world. And so instead, if we can talk about and acknowledge these potholes, we've found that it can help us sort of recenter the voices and perspectives of survivors and those who are dealing with the most harm caused by this violence. And so we can kind of get back to imagining how we can, on both an individual level and a collective community level, work on really changing the conditions that exist right now within our communities that allow this violence and exploitation to keep happening. And so for today's conversation, I was thinking, okay, we should like share an example maybe of how we can think about potholes. So one that I was thinking we could check in about or chat about is, so within our Don't Buy It project curriculum, there's that curriculum has a focus on and around commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, and how can we look at preventing this from continuing to happen in our communities. And so, when we were thinking about and creating this curriculum, we were like, okay, there's definitely a handful of these sort of arguments or potholes that pop up when you are talking about sex trafficking and prevention of that. And so one example that we pulled is what we would call like an empowered sex worker kind of argument, which can be seen as a pothole. We've heard this, and I think the debates and discussions and arguments have happened, for a lot of years around this concept of protecting sex workers and sex worker rights, as well as how do we also help support and advocate for survivors who are not making a choice to engage in that type of work. And so again, oftentimes, and I've been in these conversations myself as well, where it gets really heated oftentimes, right? Folks feel angry or unheard, and nothing really changes, and then we're stuck, right? And so for today, I'm going to pop up our first question for Hunter and I to chat about. So, Hunter, when you're thinking about your work, what kind of potholes do you run into when you're doing that? And are there any specific ones maybe that come to mind for you?
Yeah, and before I answer that, Shannon, I'll probably just loop back really briefly to kind of that introductory example that you talked about within, empowered sex workers. And I think it's like this importance of nuance of choice, because I think folks who are actively choosing to be a part of the sex work industry, or folks who maybe are outside of that and are assuming that anyone who engages in sex work always has an active choice in being a part of that, because the reality is they might not have the opportunity. Maybe they feel like, they have to put food on the table for children, or just to, have their basic needs being met. if they already have those basic needs being met, maybe they wouldn't actively choose to be in the sex work industry. And so I think there's this illusion of choice, and there's much more nuance that people have to be able to maybe put that layer of defensiveness down first to be able to have that open and honest conversation too. So that's just something that popped up for me when you were bringing up that example. Kind of switching over to the then general question here. So what potholes have I run into doing this work? This is something that's very recent for me. I think it's this idea that sometimes as individuals or organizations within the anti-sexual violence movement or any kind of social justice work is that sometimes we don't creatively think about getting around these barriers and navigating them. So for instance, I think we get really stuck, which is understandable, but we get really stuck into tenets of white supremacy. So for example, like, well, this is how it's always been done, so we're just going to keep doing it, in this process or this way, right? And I think that really upholds ideas of like perfectionism and worship of the written word. And it's really easy to do that since that's the kind of natural world that we live in, right? But I think being able to take a prevention perspective to this, like if we are able to think creatively and say like, oh, well, even though I have this deliverable deadline or this presentation, like, life comes up, life happens, we can kind of navigate these barriers in a different way than we always have in the past, right? And so being able to think creatively about preventing harm and conflict and knowing that we all have values, how can we still sustain those without being attached to these tenets of white supremacy as well? Because if we are able to create safer workspaces, if we're able to have more resources and capacity to implement the changes in prevention values that we're wanting to bring out into the wider community, that's going to have ripple effects for us as individuals and for folks in our communities too. And so I think it's really easy to slide into the way about how we've always been doing work, but how can we kind of go into that uncomfortableness and be like, hey, how can we like sit in this and creatively think about other options maybe that we haven't historically done in the past?
Okay, that was a really that was really good. You got me there, sir, because I'm thinking about, wow, yeah, so the habits of white supremacy and wow, and all of those sort of isms and phobias and the ways that our society, thinking specifically of like the United States, man, like almost every single one of those could be considered a pothole, and a place where we get stuck, right? Man, so that just is like, blowing my mind a little bit. And that's why I appreciate these conversations, because I was feeling stuck a little bit ago, actually, before even, coming onto this table. Part of our staff meeting this morning was talking about our work and what is it about men as peacemakers that is unique, and like how are we showing up in community, and what exactly are we bringing and offering into community. And so we were doing this exercise, and I was working with one of my other colleagues, and so I'm trying to answer this question, and she'd be like, but what does that mean? But what are, that seems really fluffy. I don't know what you mean. Like, try to give me more. And I was just like, everything I say, you're shooting it down. Of course, in a way that is actually helpful, not like in a mean way. But it really feels like I'm sort of stuck in a pothole right now a little bit in terms of the work that I do, because I think exactly to your point of like, this is how we've always done things and this is how we must keep doing it. I think that's one of the really cool and unique things about Men as Peacemakers, is that hasn't been our story. Our story has really been about how do we adapt and change and flow with the ever-changing needs of our communities, right? And they all look different, and it depends on what part of the community you're working with or talking with or building connections and collaborations with. And so man, just the feeling stuckness of, is our work having an impact, or how are we talking about these things in a way that everyday folks who are not a part of this work, they don't do this every day like we do. Like, how are we making these things really easy to understand? How are we kind of constantly thinking outside of the box to reach new folks, and not just sort of the like preach to the choir thing that we hear a lot about. So that just took my brain to like a whole different place. So thank you for that. I'm going to be thinking more about that for sure. And then I was also thinking about, in my specific work, I've only been working with the Don't Buy It project here at Menace Peacemakers for, actually going on 2 years now. But prior to that, there were other folks working on this program. And when we originally created our sort of mainstream curriculum, which was, almost 10 years ago now, we, put it out. We were like, hey, we created this great tool. Here, community, here's what we've got, And we started hearing a lot of feedback from folks in the sex worker community, but then also, more specific to my experience, I started hearing and getting pushback from transgender friends of mine and colleagues who do work specifically for trans and LGBT folks in communities who have experienced harm or who are houseless, or, and they were just pushing back, and they're like, this curriculum really does not deal with the nuances that exist for LGBTQ plus people. Like, when you have a community of folks who, because of the blatant systems of homophobia and transphobia that exist in our society right now, it's really hard for LGBT folks to find jobs. It's really hard for them to find housing. And so then, as you sort of said, right, like, what choice do you have? You have to survive. You have to do what you got to do to put food on the table for yourself, let alone if you have kids or other chosen family folks that you're kind of taking care of and helping with that. And it was really eye-opening. And at the same time, I had sort of my own sort of righteous indignation about, well, this tool can be helpful. It can do all of these things. And then, exactly what this pothole conversation is about. We'd be stuck. Someone would always leave feeling frustrated that I was doing this work that wasn't inclusive for trans and queer folks. And then I would feel stuck on the other end, well, of course, I'm a part of this community. I care deeply about creating tools that are helpful for people in my own community as well as mainstream communities. And and so if I would have had this language, years ago, I could have been like, look, we're getting stuck. But how can we redirect the conversation back to maybe some shared values that we do have, right? Where we can say, okay, we both can agree that we want everyone to be free and safe and have what they need. And so how can we redirect? How can we work together maybe to look at these nuances? What could we do rather than, the fighting that I think is sort of our society. Your side believes this, my side believes this, and now we're going to fight about it. And I think anyone listening, and including us, can say this is not a viable way to continue moving in our communities because of that separation and polarization that happens. But at the same time, you've got two sides of a coin where we all, really deeply believe that our way of living life is the way, rather than, okay, we actually got to zoom way out and take into consideration the fact that everyone has these different experiences and different violence and trauma they may have, experienced in their life that then, shapes how they show up and how they have these conversations, right? So it's an interesting balance that we find ourselves in, I think, because it's really easy to say, well, this is my side of things. This is the side that I will stay on. But then what happens to all of those other folks, right, on the other side? And how can we connect as a community when no one is willing to sit and listen and say, we're getting stuck here, I don't know if that brings anything up for you, Hunter.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was thinking about maybe a little bit earlier in your explanation, John, is when we're experiencing potholes and when we're working intentionally and authentically with community, a lot of pushback that I've seen, witnessed, and heard in our general anti-violence movement is the fact, for instance, let's say violence and we're a movement. So I just want to make sure I think my screen paused on me for a second. Sorry.
You're back. You're back.
Good. So just to reiterate really briefly, if we're doing a training on how oppression is related to sexual violence, I think there has historically been some pushback about well, why are we talking about racism or transphobia when we should be talking about sexual violence, right? And I think that if folks are just coming up into the movement, that's understandable. That's how I started in the movement. I didn't have that awareness and the intersectionality piece about how oppression is very clearly linked to sexual violence, but really erasing that defensiveness that people might have, because we really have to be able to dig into that really historical intersections about how oppression and violence are very, very clearly integrated together, right? And so being able to have those deeper and authentic conversations together, because I think harm is just a vast umbrella that more than likely everyone has experienced in some capacity or knows people who have experienced violence and harm close to them. And so how can we make some of those common connections? And when you're talking about two sides of a coin, it's well, we have a common thread here. We're both a coin, just for example, right? How can we see what these common threads or values are between us, even if we have different perspectives or perhaps different values, but we have something that's, connecting us in some way. So how can we really dig in and create some of that more thriving community connectedness when we have those connections, as few or as many as there could be between folks too?
Yeah, that is such a good, it's like a perfect transition or segue, because I think then it's yeah, okay, if we can recognize that there are these things that cause us to get off into the weeds, or we're stuck in this pothole, whatever metaphor feels best for you, then the question is, how can we have these conversations, really holding all of the nuances instead of showing up thinking, well, there's a right way to have this conversation and then there's wrong ways or right answers and wrong answers. What does it look like? And let me see if I can get our... Okay, here we go. I'm going to pop up our next question. So we talked a little bit about work. So where do you see these potholes showing up in your everyday life and relationships? Where are the places that you find yourself getting stuck? And I don't have an answer immediately. So if you do, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think this is what comes to mind right away for me. The potholes that I am seeing in just every space of my life, in any type of relationship, is communication and expectations. And I think those two are very much interacting together. And I think, we might have unintentionally, we might have expectations of people in our life, whether it's our intimate partners, our friends, family, and that might not necessarily come from a harmful space, right? But I think that can create divisions or separation where it's like, you have this thought that, if just for example, in an intimate relationship, like you cooked dinner and you might have an assumption that, your partner is going to wash the dishes or something like that, but there's no communication, right? And so like, you can't expect that to happen when there's no type of communication. There's no shared expectation or mutual agreements about what is going to happen. And so I think conflict and harm can really easily arise when there's a lack of communication. And I think that really happens a lot, in kind of these topics of our movement, because for one, like talking about sex and violence and similar pieces, like that's oftentimes in our society a very uncomfortable conversation to have. And so we might have all these assumptions or expectations going into a conversation, but we don't actively explain what those are. And so I think having that active communication, actively listening, like I see all the time, like on social media, there's like water flowing into a brick, and it's saying like, this is not you actively listening. This is you preparing your next statement or counter in the argument, but you want to be a sponge and soak up and truly listen to that and, validate and hear what that other person has to say. Because I think that's, for me, at least personally, I think I don't need someone to agree with me, but I need folks to like validate my experience and like just hear me out. I think that's something that most of us probably don't experience in arguments or like larger societal issues, right? Because we just don't have that practiced idea to be able to actively listen, to like have authentic communications, conversations with integrity. And so I think potholes arise a lot because we don't communicate and we have a lot of expectations. Hopefully that like sentence wraps everything up what I was trying to explain.
I think so. I mean, I think you bring up some really great points. And as soon as you were like expectations, I was like, oh, yeah, there are a lot of those that I think we each have individually, right? And then we have expectations of, you know, organizations and agencies and all of these different systems that are around us, right? Well, they should have it this way, or it should be set up like this, and then when it isn't, it's like, oh, but wait a minute, we didn't actually communicate that thing to that person or that group, right? To say, well, hey, this is something that I've experienced, this is a way that I've been harmed, and if you could talk about it like this, then it would be easier for me to sort of understand where you're coming from. But I think you're absolutely right. Like, we are not really taught how to have uncomfortable conversations. I mean, even that phrase, uncomfortable conversations, I'm like, I could feel in me like, I want to shy away from that, right? I think that is a lot of our sort of built-in tendency is like, oh, things are getting uncomfortable, we better stop the conversation, rather than continuing to kind of sit in it. Maybe we don't have that answer, right away. Maybe we just sit there for 5 minutes and, okay, I'm really trying to take in what you shared with me, in order to validate, right? To be able to understand, because these people are our people, right? They're our family members, they're our partners or our kids or friends. And I know for me, a pothole that comes up oftentimes when I'm having conversations like with my family, for example, one of the places we tend to get stuck is around like religious worldviews and like why harm happens. Well, if you were living your life in this way, then maybe that harm wouldn't be happening. And so it's like there's this touch point that is sort of underlying all of my relationships with some of my family, where we have differing spiritual beliefs. and worldviews. And when I'm, like, for example, talking about something I'm struggling with my kid or with parenting or something like that, their perspective comes from this Christian tradition, and so that's what they're offering to me. Well, also, I think we've learned and we've been practicing this for quite a few years now, me and my family, but that's, of course, it makes sense. That's what they would then be able to bring to the conversation. Well, if you tried this or this or this based on what I believe in the Bible, that might help. And then I have to immediately not be like, ugh, don't tell me about that thing that we disagree about. Rather than just like, okay, I know where they're coming from. I can see that they are coming to me in love, right? But then I tend to just be like, ugh, it sort of shuts me down. And then I think, well, yeah, what does it look like? And I don't have this answer, perfectly formulated yet, because I think it's something that I'm kind of constantly working on in some of my relationships with folks. And I think for me, what seems to help is like trying to bring it back to like whatever that main thing is, right? It's like if it's a conversation about my parenting or how I'm trying to learn and better support my kid, it's like, okay, I see. We're stuck in a pothole about our religious beliefs right now, and we're not able to like figure that out or fix it. And what can we do to support my kid right now in this moment or today, right? Like I think there are ways, again, where it's like, if we can at first notice that we're getting stuck in a pothole, then it's like, okay, let me take a step back. Let me think about how can we get back to this really important conversation, right, about how I can be a better dad to my kid. And gosh, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that happens a lot in a lot of my relationships, where it's like we start talking about one thing and then it just goes into the weeds very quickly, and we sort of lose track of that main thing that we were trying to kind of figure out together, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a tendency for that to happen when there are like shared values or very like strongly held values that might be at a contrast with people in relationship or community together. So like, I don't know, going into a family gathering, like, oh, I wonder if this topic is going to come up, and there's just a lot of anxiety going into that space. I think, that is certainly difficult. And at the same time, I think, if there has been conversations about that theme or that contrast that is between folks, like being able to come back to that and come to that conversation where everyone feels like there isn't all this tightness and anxiety in their body, and being able to come to that conversation like in an open-minded way. So like you don't have to get it all figured out in a 20-minute conversation, like being able to ebb and flow back into that, because we as individuals in society are going to like be fluid and change as well. And so I think it's important to be able to continually come back to really important conversations, because we are always kind of, shifting, whether that's our ideas or our values, whatever that's going to be, because nothing truly is static in any way, at least the way that I see it.
Ooh, yeah, and just being able to like hold that adaptability, and I mean, because I think most people would agree with that, like, yeah, life and things are constantly shifting in the ways that we show up in our families, and politics, goodness, I mean, wars and things happening all around our world. Man, and it's tricky. It's very tricky, and yeah, I think I'm also thinking about like, how would I say it? Like, when you have such a really strong opinion about a matter, whatever it is, whether it's, violence prevention, whether it's parenting or, whatever, something on the political landscape, it's like there's not a lot of give anymore. Like folks used to, or I don't know, maybe this is just the story we've told ourselves, but it seems like in the past there were ways that we were able to sort of like reach across the aisle, that sort of, I know I've heard quite a few older folks, talking about, politics, for example, Republicans, Democrats would sort of battle it out on the floor that day, and then later they'd be having dinner, and, their families would be there. And so there wasn't this, like, we are completely separate kind of concept. I don't know that, is real, but there is something to that adaptability and just like acknowledging that my way is what maybe feels right for me, but like there are so many different ways that other folks can approach that same thing, and really like, how do we not get lost? How do we not get lost and then just end up being so frustrated that we're like, I never want to talk to that person again. We're never going to touch on that topic again because it's so frustrating. Or, and it's like, those are the conversations though that we have to keep having them. Those are the ones that are really important, if we're, all really concerned with creating safer communities for everybody. We have to be willing to continue to like lean into those uncomfortable conversations. And so I'm gonna pop this up, our next question, onto the screen here. So we're kind of touching on this now. It's sort of shifting to this, but what are some ways that you who are watching or listening, and those of us here, what are some ways that we can continue having difficult and necessary conversations without getting stuck in an argument, in a fight, being mad at each other? What do you think?
Yeah, Sean, I think based on what you were just talking about, kind of this, folks might have this perspective of like, we can't reach across the aisle, or there's like, no one can agree on anything anymore. People are just completely divided. And whether that's like the truth or the reality or not, that's what people are experiencing and feeling. And so I think in the first place, we have to validate that. And so being able to just validate someone's experience, unless they're like actively not validating somebody else's experience, or like actively oppressing other folks, I think that's a different conversation. But I think outside of that, we do have to validate people's experiences, because there are multiple truths in the fact that people just have different experiences, right? Like if you say some type of statement, Sean, I might perceive that differently than somebody else. And that's just how our realities are. And I think we have to have that foundational and collective understanding that, like, that's why it's so important to have communication and to be honest and open about the difficulties and nuances of these conversations. So that's initially what came to mind for me, just the fact that we do have to like just be honest and like validate people's experiences. I think that's how we can really build community together. Something else, I think, something that I've learned in therapy, probably one of the biggest lessons I've ever discovered, is the fact that trying to replace the word but with and. I think there's several reasons for that. I've heard some people say like anything after the but is a lie, or like doesn't count, which I don't know if that's the best way to think about it. That being said, I think when we just utilize and, it reinforces that idea of like multiple truths, or like, saying like, I get your experience, like those are your values, and like these are mine, and like how can we come together? How can we build something through that? Like either can we like ground ourselves in the intersecting values we already currently have and shared together, or like how can we find something from that. Um, and so that's just something that I really try to ground myself in, utilizing that. And another reason for that is the fact that I think we have to get away from binaries, because that looking at the and gets us away from either or thinking. And more often than not, there's not just two options or two ideas in anything, right? And so if we really ground ourselves in the and, it really opens up, a spectrum or so many different options, rather than just being stuck in, the very few limited options we historically have found ourselves a part of.
Definitely, I love what you're saying there about just that practice of not but and. I've literally like said that in the middle of conversations. Wait, not but and this is yada yada. But it does feel really important when I'm thinking about this because it's like what you're saying, right? Like we can validate that other person's perspective. Like if I'm listening to a friend and they're saying, maybe this is a way that you hurt me, and here's, what I'd like to see, or they're talking about maybe a boundary they want to put down or something like that. It's like, okay, I hear you telling me this is how I hurt you, right? I can hear that, but I didn't mean to do that, right? It's like the but really has like a closing down feel, like I'm shutting the door, versus and I didn't mean to do that, and here's how I'm gonna try to like not do that again. Like and feels much more like open-ended, like there is a way forward. There's an openness to thinking about it in a different way, right? Like and this had me thinking about empathy and how we can, like, I don't know that we really build empathy into conversations a whole lot, or at least time to experience the empathy. So if someone's sharing their perspective with me, and maybe it's a little bit different than mine, it's like I'm very quick to be like, well, yeah, but this is what I think, and here's why I think that, rather than taking a minute to be like, man, okay, what would that feel like in me? What would that feel like for me, to have that experience? How would that make me believe differently or act differently in my life? Like there's no time for that in the middle of conversations because I feel like we're just constantly talking. There's not a lot of like time that we set aside to listen and then to like absorb and think about, well, yeah, man, what would that feel like in my body if I had experienced this harm that someone shared with me? How might I respond? And then it gives us this way of trying to like understand rather than prescribing. Like I know what's best for that person, or I know that if they just changed their belief about this one thing, then everything would be good. It's like there's a lot of ego there. I think a lot of like judgment that we're sort of all taught to be like, well, I have the right answer. This is the answer I was taught my whole life. This is how we do it, right? Like you said earlier, we've always done it this way. But then it just feels like it closes it down rather than allowing us to expand in that conversation or in that relationship. How do we deepen and get closer to the people in our lives when we know that we're going to be disagreeing? We know that we're going to be causing harm along the way. And then, I don't know, yeah, there's just this very defensive, I need to be able to explain my way and why it's the right way rather than being like, okay, I'm one tiny human on this giant planet spinning in this entire galaxy of universes, and I really, really think I have the right the right answer. And I think it's just what you said earlier. It's like there's so many right answers, but we don't take the time to be like, let's think about this. What else could we do? If we are disagreeing about these two ways, what are 3 and 4 and 5 other ways that we could maybe find a connection, right?
Yeah, most definitely, Sean. And I think I'm grateful that you brought up empathy. It was more empathy for ourselves as individuals, but empathy for all others in our community as well. And that made me think of, especially within these, heated and tenuous situations we often find ourselves in, the idea of like intent versus impact. And I think that kind of goes back to that fact about like validating someone's experience, because like even if you didn't intend to harm someone, like you still had that impact on them. And so I think that's again really important to be like, you know, that also brings up accountability and like that empathy as well, right? Because just going back to those things, that there are multiple truths, because you might not have intended that, but sorry, I might have harmed you, and I am understanding that I had that impact on you, right? So I think really trying to address that empathy and intent versus impact, I think, is just easily gets lost on a lot of situations because defensiveness, and it just feels at times like hard to find that source of connectedness between folks at times.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like our world is just breeding more and more disagreement and disconnection. And I think, what we know, especially when thinking about men and masculine folks in our communities, like when there's disconnection, then it's like it sort of leads to isolation, right? And then it's like that's when more and more harm can start happening or is more likely to happen, right? When we're disconnected from our communities or from our people. And there's something too that's coming up for me around like we aren't often really honest with the people that we're having conversations when like something harmful is said or something where it's like, ooh, I felt that thing. And because I felt that little mini harm that just happened, right, whether it's intentional or not, right, it's like, okay, I'm going to stuff that back down and let's keep having this really serious, important conversation rather than being like, whoa, okay, hold on. Let's pause. When you said that thing there, I felt this way. And if I don't pause and like be honest about that, like it's gonna color the way that I respond, right? It's gonna continue to affect my emotions, whether I'm getting more and more frustrated, and then becoming more and more closed off to hearing what that person is saying because, like, oh, that little thing, feels like an attack on my character or something like that. Like we make it really personal, but then we aren't always. I would say often we are not honest about those things that like kind of prick us or poke us. And it's like every single one of those then has an impact on how we respond to that person, and man, there's just a lot about, I think, how we can learn to have authentic, honest conversations in really different ways, I think, than how a lot of us were taught. It's just making me think a lot about like all of my friends and the ways that we talk about, ooh, that thing hurt me, or like you didn't show up for me this day and I really needed you to show up, and how do we sort of wrestle through, our failings as individuals, because of course every single one of us on this planet causes harm, and I don't think there's a way that we can stop that. But I think that there's a way that we can continue to grow, learning through these ways that we cause harm, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you really just validated what I was thinking about right now, Sean. Is like, we're never going to be perfect, and that we are going to cause harm in the future. And so like if and really when that happens, it's not like a reason to like get out of the conversation or to like never try again because like I messed up or I harmed someone or something. Like I think it's the fact that like we have to wrestle with this idea of like being uncomfortable and knowing that difficult conversations or harm may happen, but like we still have community. Like we can still develop something together, right? And so if we have that collective understanding that we are still committed to, this relationship, this community, whatever we built here, like how do we heal or repair that potential harm and like continue to get better? Because it's it's difficult to bring these ideas we've talked today into a practice, right? I'm not going to be able to every single time, like, you know, have 100% empathy or like always be aware of the impacts that I have on people, right? I'm going to try as hard as I can. That's not always going to happen, right? And so I can still commit to myself to like advocating for that practice, being accountable and doing better over time. So I think what you said, Sean, that reminder of like, we're not going to be perfect. We should never pursue perfection because it's not possible. It's not good. And knowing that we can rely on community to create like success and thriving spaces together where we can lean on each other too.
Yeah, and this is bringing it back to like what you were talking about around expectations. And do we expect for that other person to show up and be perfect and not cause harm? Like there's this part of what you're saying, right? Like where we recognize I am not a perfect guy. I'm gonna mess up. I'm gonna mess up today and tomorrow and in different ways my entire life. But then are we also willing to say, yeah, and these people are also gonna mess up, and we have to be able to like hold both of those things. Like we can't expect our people or the other side of the aisle or whoever it is that we're like getting stuck in these potholes, right, to be perfect and to do it perfectly. If we don't also, it's like, how do we hold both things, right? Both things are true. We're both going to be causing harm in some way, but how do we then move forward? How do we continue to be like, okay, we're staying in relationship? And I think it is a choice, right? I think it's a choice to lean into that discomfort, and to lean into connection and community, even when it's really hard. Some days it's real hard. I know we all can relate to that, right? Whether it's your family or your colleagues or community folks, right? Like we all are messy human people, who my belief is that a lot of us are doing our best. We're really trying to do our best. We're not out there, right? Most men are not using violence. Most men are not causing this kind of harm, and yet we all are causing harm. And so how do we continue to lean in and to continue to choose to show up even when it's hard, and even when we know, oh man, we're going to disagree, or Thanksgiving dinner, those uncles are the ones I'm not going to talk to, because I know if we even try to have a conversation, it's going to get ugly, and I'm just going to avoid that, rather than being like, Uncle, why is it that you think that? Let me understand. Tell me more about that, rather than, oh, that guy, It's really challenging, I think, even, right, for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about this in our work and in our lives, like, there's always ways that we can grow and expand, and I think that's what gives me hope, is like, even in the moments where I'm like, I don't have an answer, I do not know what I think the right answer is, or I do not know how to repair this harm that has happened, but I'm going to keep showing up, and I'm going to keep trying to figure it out, with other folks in community, right? It's not just an individual thing, right? Like we all need each other, to help us along the ways. And so I don't know about you, Hunter, I'm feeling grateful for this conversation, even though, it felt, leading up to this, I was like, how are we going to have this conversation? I don't know. And here we are. It's been almost an hour. And, I feel like one step closer to like, okay, it's a practice. We just have to keep practicing showing up, and that's where we see the growth and the change happening in our lives. And so, yeah, so we want to thank all of you who have tuned in to join us for this conversation about potholes and about getting stuck in hard conversations. We want to just say thanks for joining us here today. We know you've been stuck before. We all get stuck. And I think, when we can find ways, when we can talk about the stuckness, then it's like, oh, hey, that person had a really great idea. I'm going to try that next time, So thank you, Hunter. I think you've given me a lot of good ideas about how I can continue to show up and have hard conversations without getting completely stuck. And yeah, we're really excited to be back. As a reminder, we hold these conversations every other Thursday at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time, so you can join us back for another conversation on July 25th. Let me pop that. Okay, there it is. Join us on July 25th, and we're going to talk more about what does it look like to move through these stuck moments, these potholes that we find ourselves in, and what does it look like to practically make some change in our relationships and families and all of the places we show up in our communities. So join us back here next time. And again, you can follow us on social media to stay connected with us. You can like and follow our Facebook page. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also listen to a lot of previous conversations we've had now available on Spotify. So, if you happen to be watching this conversation as a part of your virtual training for the Don't Buy It project, check out the description below for instructions about downloading the discussion guides. And as always, we encourage you, yes, you, to have a conversation like this with the people in your lives, because it's, really through these conversations that together we are building communities that can be free from violence, where all of us, every single one of us, can thrive. So thank you again for joining us here at the kitchen table, and we will see you back in a couple of weeks.